My book takes for granted that the US nation state is an empire rooted in white supremacy from its founding until today. Its laws have been fundamental to empire, and immigration restriction and guest worker programs can be understood as an ongoing instrument of the US national security state. I won't be going into much detail about the US national security state, but I do want to iterate that before I begin. But the book came out of my work as a graduate student when I was interested initially in the history and formation of Latinx laboring communities in California, where I grew up. Being half Chicana, I was interested in my family's history as the working backbone of the state, as well as in the challenge of fighting against the social injustices created by poorly paid manual and service work that I witnessed firsthand with my family. I found that much of the dependency on Mexican labor in California emerged from the history of the farm guest worker program known as the bracero program, when the US and Mexican governments recruited and contracted about 5 million Mexican men to work temporarily in the United States farm fields from 1942 to 1964 as quote unquote guest workers. And I highlight the term guest again, because a lot of what I write about in the book is about this language of a welcome, right? That workers were invited to come as our neighbors, as guests who journeyed here to earn a livable wage and to ameliorate some of the inequalities that historically Mexican workers faced in California and in the United States. So the program really started out as an ameliorative. But as I started my research on the bracero program in the archives, I found that many activists and scholars have tended to be critical of the bracero program, calling it out as a form of slave labor. While I agreed, I also found that this criticism of the labor program was deeply problematic for many reasons. But I found that constructing braceros as slave labor had something to do in and of itself with the construction of freedom. Hence the title of my book, Contracting Freedom, which implies the state both literally giving laborers contracts that promise their rights, but also constricting or contracting workers' rights and freedoms. At the same time, I was also interested in the colonial origins of the bracero program, not just how it was, quote unquote, just like the American institution of slavery or just like European colonialism in other places, but how it was deeply imbricated in a history of enslavement and colonialism in the United States and the world. I also wanted to move past the paradigm that the program was a form of imported colonialism and hope to show the processes and practices of the program that directly stemmed from a history of colonialism and empire. This is important because what I found was that state officials, civil rights activists, farm labor advocates, in qualifying the quote unquote freedoms of the labor program during its initiation, they erased and elided race and empire from the program, making it a challenge for us even today to see these historical connections. So for example, in chapter 1 of the book, I include a genealogy of the temporary labor contract and trace its origins to African slavery under European colonialism. I demonstrate how the labor contract emerged during 19th century efforts to abolish slavery as a means to create a quote unquote free or voluntary supply of wage labor that would be a potential solution to ending enslaved labor. However, the guise of freedom was productive for labor coercion, making coercion less visible, but also authorizing the expansion of state power over workers. So as I did my research on the bracero program, I noticed that few historians placed the program within the context of the other farm labor programs that emerged at the same time during World War II, including the US farm labor or guest worker programs with Puerto Rico, the British West Indies, or Barbados, the Bahamas, and Jamaica, and the contract farm labor program that recruited incarcerated Japanese Americans as farm labor during Japanese American incarceration. So each chapter of the book addresses one of these labor programs, examining how official debates framed them as programs of labor freedom, which legitimated and extended US racial and imperial domination into the post-World War II era by erasing the realities of labor coercion. I show how in the early 1940s, for example, state officials, labor activists, and civil rights advocates like Ernesto Galarza, for example, argued that a US-Mexico contract labor program could potentially provide rights and freedoms to workers. They highlighted the liberatory potential of the labor contract to undo the inequalities that characterized Mexican migrant labor in the Southwest in the first half of the 20th century. The same went for the other labor programs. Once the labor programs began, these labor advocates and activists realized that the programs were fundamentally exploitative and fought for contract workers' rights in an attempt to prevent the contract from being a productive tool for growers and their associations to exploit migrant labor. However, in looking to the state to resolve the tensions and exploitations produced by racial capitalism, they gave the state further legitimacy to racialize and control labor through the logic of freedom. And that is where, in my book, Race, Class, and Nation come in. Because while guest workers signed temporary labor contracts that indicated their voluntary passage as wage laborers, not slave laborers, what they experienced was quite the opposite. Their movements were controlled. They often did not have many job opportunities where they come from due to a history of US imperial interventions in their sending countries. So how much choice was there for workers? So each chapter considers the perspectives of these workers and how they reacted to the debates over contract freedom propagated by all governments involved. Offered a set of rights and wage guarantees through the labor contract, Japanese American, Puerto Rican, Mexican, and Afro-Caribbean workers all protested the lack of government enforcement of the contract guarantees and the failure of the state to protect their rights. They protested the violence and lack of freedom that resulted from the programs through strikes, work stoppages, by ripping their contracts up in the fields, or quote unquote jumping the contracts and choosing to go illegal so that they could choose their own employers, and by pointing to the problem of national borders and citizenship to claim their own vision of freedom. In the end, I argue that liberal state governance could not solve the problems that workers faced, but is in fact part of the problem, that the processes of erasure produced by the governmental regulation of freedom and rights given through the contract is how workers continuously became subject to state power and empire into the contemporary era. In other words, it was the liberalism of the contract that reproduced violence and empire. The question of legality is therefore an issue of great importance in the book. Not only did the formation of the World War II guest worker programs produce legality, they also resulted in the state criminalization of illegality and the expansion of the Border Patrol, making workers again subject to state power. If one of the only ways that workers could resist was to jump the contract and quote, go illegal, then it was the legality of the contract that produced the conditions for illegality and labor coercion. The contract thus literally produced violence and coercion through the deportation of those workers who resisted, such that looking to the state to fix guest worker programs only continued the processes by which racialized workers became subject to state power, or as Moon has referred to, the national security state, the US national security state. So what goes on today with guest worker programs is but a continuation of the consequences of a 300-year history of slavery and contract labor. But the modern explanation of guest worker programs frames them as an adequate solution to undocumented labor, which is in and of itself a product of the 1940s and 1950s efforts in the United States to protect worker freedoms, but then also control migrant farm workers, making them targets of racialized state violence. Now, this is important today because we continue to believe that the rights provided in the labor contract, guest worker contracts, which have not changed much since the World War II labor programs, will protect workers from exploitation. That guest worker labor contracts are somehow better than quote unquote illegal immigration and can be fixed through government regulation. As we've seen in the immigration reform debates over the contemporary quote immigration crisis in the United States, the conversation still focuses on preventing undocumented immigration and offering guest workers as a solution and a means to provide a legal pathway to work in the United States that will presumably protect migrant workers. And it is precisely the illusion of legality and protection that authorizes and elides the continued racialization and inequality these workers face, as well as the violence and coercion that results. And that is why I argue in the book that we can no longer look to the state regulation of contract labor programs as a viable solution for migrant workers. So just going to take a drink of water really quick. So yes, improving policy and creating more inclusive labor and social policies and laws for farm workers, guest workers, and other low-wage workers is absolutely necessary. However, what I'm arguing is that policy changes are based in a nation-oriented conceptualization of rights that decide who is deserving of those rights and who is not, which are race-based decisions that often result in unintended consequences. The question then becomes, can we imagine a borderless world that would not racialize workers as outside of the nation and outside of citizenship, that would not make them subject to state power and empire? As I importantly show in the book, workers fought to create a borderless imaginary, sin fronteras. Today, that involves not just paths to citizenship in the United States, but imagining a world in which the concept of national borders are no longer essential tools of governance, deciding who is deserving of rights, which re-entrenches the national security state. I hope that the book awakens an urge to large-scale action in the United States against contemporary H-2A farm labor programs, to expose them, as well as the injustice and dehumanization that guest workers often face even today as a result.